Morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar hosted by the Social and Ethics Committee Forum. It's an IoDSA forum, and we are here to share our knowledge relating to the Social and Ethics Committee. The particular paper today that is the focus is the governance of ethics, a ethical culture oversight criteria for the Social and Ethics Committee. We have a great panel today. As usual, facilitated by the chairperson of the Social Ethics Committee Forum, and that's Professor Dion Rousseau. I'm going to ask my panelists to switch on their cameras. They can keep themselves muted just so that you can see faces while I introduce. We've got Prof. Dion Rousseau, Chairperson of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum, as I mentioned. He's also the CEO of the Ethics Institute. He's a member of the King Committee for Corporate Governance in South Africa and a Chartered Director. And he's also the author of the Social and Ethics Committee Handbook. So you can see he's well versed in the subject matter for today. Our second panelist, Fatima Ravat, is a member of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum as well, and an associate of the Ethics Institute and a certified director. We've got Claudel van Eck, a non-executive director and a certified director, and Getty Semelani, non-executive director for various organizations, and both Claudel and Getty serve on Social and Ethics committees. So they're here to share their experience and their knowledge. We've got the paper. We will be sharing the links. You'll see the links in the chat as we go through the webinar, and we'll be sharing other documents that are related to the topic. So when an author mentions a particular paper, we will be sharing those links, and don't worry if you miss the link, because the link will be posted will be circulated in the post-event communication. I do want to mention this is a forum event for both members and non-members, but I'd like to just remind the members of the Institute that all these papers that we share are available on our IoDSA member app. It's a fabulous new app that we launched in August, where everything is within your phone, one little app away. You can search everything. Just go search in the App Store or wherever you find your apps, and you can download it, and it's at your fingertips. So if you're in a meeting and you want to look at something, it's all there. Let's be honest, everything is run from our phones lately. So you can access the papers easily through your phone and the app. I'm now going to hand over to Dion. Just also one little housekeeping reminder, you're welcome to chat in the chat about stuff. Please put your comments in there. Keep it polite and about the subject matter. Don't make it personal for anybody who makes a comment you don't agree with. And please post your question in the Q&A. If at some point later on in the Q&A someone wants to put their hand up, we may take a live question. We'll just see how it goes, and enjoy the session. Okay, thanks everyone. Dion, over to you. And I don't know if my other panelists would like to turn their cameras off. It's up to you. And take it away, Dion. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie, and a very warm good morning here from sunny Pretoria. Quite hot here in Pretoria the last few days. It's great to have all of you here. I was watching the comments in the chat coming in, and people connecting from right across the country, but also beyond our borders. I just noticed someone from Seychelles who also said good morning from there. So great to have all of you here. We hope that this session will be most valuable to you, but we also look forward to your contributions. We want to keep this as interactive as possible. After we've introduced the paper and ask our two other speakers to comment on the paper, we will open it up for your questions and comments, and please use the Q&A for that. So let's start with the Social and Ethics Committee Forum of the IoDSA. This forum is supported by the Ethics Institute, and the purpose of the forum is to discuss matters related to social and ethics committees. In other words, if there are new developments, the forum would discuss those developments and how they impact on the working of a social and ethics committee. But another very important objective of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum is to provide guidance on matters where we sense that people are struggling to make sense of what exactly is the role of a Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to a new development. So up till now, we have provided a number of guidance papers. The first one is a template for drafting a terms of reference for a social and ethics committee. And as Julie said, she would make that link available to you, as well as links to the other papers that I will mention. The second paper that we issued earlier this year was one on repositioning the Social and Ethics Committee. And that had to, and the focus of that was to move the Social and Ethics Committee beyond its statutory mandate. Its statutory mandate is basically a compliance mandate. And as King 4 already indicated, that mandate should be broadened to also include the governance of the social and ethics performance of organizations. So that paper is also available on the IoD website. And this morning, we are launching the third guidance paper, which is on the role of the Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to the governance of ethics. Focused specifically on Principle 2 of King 4 that says that the governing body should govern the ethics of the organization in a way that supports the outcome of an ethical culture. Then, besides those guidance papers that the Social and Ethics Committee Forum launches from time to time, and by the way, we are currently working on a guidance paper on the role of the Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to ESG reporting. And that hopefully will be launched somewhere in the first part of 2023. Besides these guidance papers, the Social and Ethics Committee, or rather the Social and Ethics Committee Forum, also conducts an annual Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey. We started with that in 2020, and on the 25th of October this year, we will launch the third report of that annual Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey, where we look at all types of trends related to Social and Ethics Committees. So please mark that in your diaries, 25th of October at 9 o'clock that morning. The third edition of the annual Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey will be launched. But let's move now to the topic of this morning, which is the role of the Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to the governance of ethics. Now, if we just step back to the Companies Act and also the companies regulations, when that was introduced, we know that ethics appeared in the name of the committee, but never in its mandate or in its responsibilities. So in name, it was called the Social and Ethics Committee. But if you look at the statutory responsibility of Social and Ethics Committee, the word ethics or organizational ethics or governance of ethics was not mentioned once. Now, when King 4 was published in 2016, they tried to correct that. And under Principle 8 of King 4 that deals with the subcommittees of the governing body, it was said very explicitly that the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee should include the governance of ethics. After that, the King Committee also issued a practice note for Social and Ethics Committees based on the content of King 4, and that further reinforced that notion that part of the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee should also be the governance of organizational ethics, and obviously contribute towards that outcome of establishing an ethical culture in an organization. Now, what is quite interesting, if we look at the findings of the first two Social and Ethics Committee trend surveys, we see that this recommendation by King 4 and also by the King Committee through its practice note was taken quite seriously. And in fact, in the second Social and Ethics Committee trend survey, we asked the chairpersons of Social and Ethics Committees on what matters do they spend most of their time and focus and energy. And the top area that came out was organizational ethics. So one can see that that recommendation indeed turned into practice in Social and Ethics Committees here in South Africa. Okay, with that background, I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Fatima Rawat. She's a subject matter expert at the Ethics Institute and a co-author of this guidance paper. So Fatima, over to you. We look forward to your presentation.
Morning, Dion, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. As Professor Rousseau has mentioned, I'm the co-author and I'd like to acknowledge the lead author, Dr. Paul Foster, and the rest of the team that have been part of putting this guidance paper together. By way of background, this guidance paper actually finds its root in terms of Principle 2 of King, which, as Dion has mentioned, focuses on the role of the governing body in terms of governing ethics of the organization in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture. Now, through our work and the research that we've done, we found that governing bodies were often saying that we're actually not sure what does this mean, and practically what is it that we have to do to be able to fulfill this role? What should we look at in order to understand is there a growth in the ethical culture? What does ethical culture actually look like? What would be the components that make up the ethical culture? And what should we be asking from the ethics office in order to give to us to exercise that oversight? So largely there was a call for practical guidelines around how do governing bodies then go about fulfilling this responsibility that's set out in Principle 2, because there was an apparent lack of understanding around the how to. And that basically gave rise to the guidance paper. In our understanding, what we wanted to do was provide a short, sharp, checklist type of approach, guidance paper that would provide guidance to social and ethics committees to understand what is it that needs to be reported to them by the ethics office, but also then what should the governing body do, or the social and ethics committee do with this information? What should they assess in order to fulfill their mandate in terms of oversight over ethics? And when we talk about the word ethical culture, we take reference from the governance of ethics framework. Now, the governance of ethics framework is very useful in that it provides us with a map or a framework in terms of how we navigate arriving at the outcome of an ethical culture. It gives us guidance. It says to us, what are the things that need to happen in order for us to achieve the culture that is an ethical culture? But again, when we engage with social and ethics committees, what we were finding is a lack of kind of appreciation for what does this actually mean, and what do we have to look at in order to fulfill our responsibilities in terms of oversight. Now, we often use this word culture so loosely, and one of the things that we also found was a need to understand what do we mean when we talk about this word culture. And we draw a distinction between the culture of an organization, and when we talk about culture in its simplest form, we say that culture is the way things are done in the organization. And you can have a good culture and you can have a bad culture. And essentially, when we talk about navigating the governance of ethics framework, we are working towards establishing the outcome of a sort of culture where people do the right thing, whether someone is watching or someone's not watching. And that's the terminology we use when we talk about ethical culture. However, we also appreciate that we have different degrees of the ethical culture featuring within our organizational culture. So if you look at the illustration on my screen, the circle represents the broader culture within the organization, the way that things are being done. But if ethics is not an issue, it doesn't feature in this organization, you would have that ethical culture as a dot, barely featuring, and that's what we would describe as a fragile or a weak ethical culture. It doesn't even make an impact on the broader culture of the organization. If the ethical culture is something that's becoming a bit more pronounced, something that people are becoming a bit more aware of, then that ethical culture would tend to be, as shown by the bigger circle, something that's called underdeveloped, but would still need a lot of work to do. If you have a culture where ethics is something that's being talked about is growing awareness, then you would have somewhat of a bigger circle, and you would call that an ethical culture that is developing. And the ideal, and what we would all aspire for, and what we would want from our social and ethics committees, is through the application of Principle 2 to support the sort of environment where the culture of our organization is an ethical culture. So the way we do things in the organization is such that people do the right thing, whether someone is watching or someone is not watching. And it's so important for us to have that appreciation around the terminology of culture and ethical culture. And I'm hoping that when we have the Q&A session, it's something that we can pick up on as well. Now, in our work as the Ethics Institute, we've come to appreciate what we call the building blocks of building an ethical culture. These are essentially the dimensions of ethical culture, elements that practically that you need to have in place as organizations that start to reflect what are the different parts that we need that build up collectively the ethical culture of the organization. And these provide us with a perspective that we're able to then share with social and ethics committees through a quantitative measure, and be able to say, if you start to look at these dimensions and use them as a lens through which you're able to assess how is ethics being made real in the organization, it gives us then a guidance to be able to apply Principle 2 practically and exercise that oversight in terms of, are we supporting the building of an ethical culture within our organizations? And so what we've done in the guidance paper is we've used these dimensions as our starting point. And the dimensions then come practically from the work that we've done and what we've seen to be the building blocks for building an ethical culture within organizations. What we also then do in the guidance paper is what we understand that there is the ethics office who reports into the Social and Ethics Committee, and the Social and Ethics Committee are two sides of the same coin. And it's important for the Social and Ethics Committee to provide guidance to the Ethics Office in terms of the sort of information that it would need so that the Social and Ethics Committee is able to exercise its oversight. And what we do in the paper then is speak not only to the role of the Social and Ethics Committee in terms of what it can look at, but also what the Ethics Office can do to provide the information and possible sources of the information that it can look to. Importantly, what we also do in the paper is point out the necessity of management exercising oversight before information is reported into the Social and Ethics Committee, so that you have your CEO or the head of your organization ensuring that sign-off before reports on these ethical dimensions actually reach the Social and Ethics Committee. Now, I'd like to take you through each of these dimensions in a little bit more detail so that we get a sense of what they actually mean and what the governing body can inquire. As we do so, we would like to invite comments on where we can improve and what we can do better on the paper. And perhaps if there's anything that we might have missed out, we really would be keen to get that feedback from my presenters today, as well as from the broader audience. So the first dimension that we then look at is around ethical accountability and responsibility. And essentially here, what we're wanting to understand is the degree to which employees are being held accountable in the organization for their behaviors, and whether the decisions that the organization is taking are consistent, are they fair, are they transparent, and is the organization being sending out the message that accountability and responsibility is important for us. It's really about sending out those signals to our stakeholders, both internally and externally, around what's ethically acceptable and what's not acceptable. And what we do in the paper then is start to expand what are the things that the governing body can ask about by way of evaluative criteria to engage the ethics office to get a sense of how is this element of ethics, accountability, and responsibility actually panning out. So the governing body could ask, how are ethical accountability measures perceived? Are they seen to be effective? Are they seen to be fair? Are they seen to be transparent? Are they seen to be consistent? Are the measures that are in place legitimate? Are they effective? And the measures in which those would be reflected back to the Social and Ethics Committee would then come through internal staff surveys, around staff perception, around HR reports, etc. So those would give a perspective to the Social and Ethics Committee around the elements of ethics, accountability, and responsibility. Essentially, what we want to gauge is, are the measures that are in place being viewed by the employees as something that is fair, that is transparent, and is the message that is going out into the organization that we take ethics seriously and that we hold people accountable. Then the next level of the dimension that we look at is around the level of employees' commitment to ethics. And the reality is that our employees beyond the management level really make up the bulk of our organization. And it's important that we're able to gauge, as the Social and Ethics Committee, are the bulk of our organization, the employees, committed to the organization's ethics, its purpose, its vision, and its values. And so through this dimension, we want to get that sense around the degree to which non-managerial employees are committed to ethics. Do they understand that ethics is important? How are they trying to engage in ethically responsible behavior in their daily activities? And some of the aspects that the governing body can then look at is the degree to which the everyday employees buy into organizations, stand on ethics. Are they holding themselves accountable? Do they understand that ethics is important for business? Are they familiar with our ethical standards and our values? And the perspective that the ethics office can then give is perspectives around what comes out from the employee surveys. What are the trainings that have been done? Are there information that perhaps HR can send that then reflects what is the behavior of everyday employees around their commitment to ethics? Then the third dimension that we introduce in the paper is around middle management commitment to ethics. And, you know, in the work that we do and in standard management work, middle management is so critical because they're the connector between the top echelons and employees themselves. And it's a common adage that middle management can make or break ethical culture because of that link that they have. And essentially, through this dimension, what we want to gauge is the degree to which these level of employees at middle management level are committed, because they are critical role models. So are they role modeling ethical behavior? Do they support employees to act ethically? Are they holding employees accountable for unethical conduct? And this would be what the Social and Ethics Committee would be curious about in order to exercise its oversight over ethical culture. And some of the things that the governing body can then look at would be, are middle managers being seen as ethical role models? How are they being perceived? Are they implementing ethics? Are they making it part of the dialogue? Are they being consistent in how they hold people responsible for unethical behavior? And useful ways in which the ethics office can then provide this feedback to the Social and Ethics Committee would be by perception surveys, ethics risk assessment findings, HR reports, staff engagement surveys. So actually quantitative measures that can feed back to the Social and Ethics Committee that would then show the way in which middle management is actually displaying their commitment. And one can also add in whether there has been specific trainings that have been conducted by the ethics office for middle managers around their role in terms of supporting the building of an ethical culture. Then the next dimension that we touch on in the paper is about leadership commitment to ethics. And this is commonly summarized in the fact that leadership sets the tone at the top for ethical culture within the organization. And the reality, as we all know, is that if leadership at a senior level doesn't prioritize ethics, then it's simply not going to be central to the organization. And this is also part of King 4 and the ethos around what corporate governance looks like. And essentially in this dimension, what the perspective that the Social and Ethics Committee would try to gauge is the degree to which leadership is then committed to doing the right thing, talking about ethics, walking the talk, making ethics real. And some of the things that the governing body can then look at, as we set out in the paper, would be, are the senior leadership actually setting an example in a way that's visible, that people can see it? Is ethics something that's actually a criteria for senior leadership? Are they taking it seriously? How are they taking it seriously? Are they displaying integrity, meaning saying something and doing the same thing, and the different ways in which the ethics office can then provide this evidence back to the social and ethics committee would be through the findings of the ethics risk survey, findings from staff engagements, also from reports from HR, but also through 360-degree assessments of senior leaders by peers and subordinates. So it would be important for the ethics office to compile all of this information and give it back to the social and ethics committee so that it can exercise its oversight. Then the next dimension that we expand on in the paper is around ethics talk. And simply put, this is really one of the most important dimensions for an ethical culture. It's really asking through the perspective, are people in the organization intentionally and actively talking about ethics? Is ethics part of the dialogue? Are they discussing values? Are they finding ways to navigate their dilemmas? And there's a very strong link between the culture of the organization and the ability for ethics talk to be strong and active within the organization. And if the environment is not conducive to ethics talk, then it's very likely that effective ethics talk can't be established. So here what the Social and Ethics Committee wants to understand is the degree to which the employees find it easy to discuss ethical issues, their challenges. Can they do so in an open and transparent manner, or are they scared to do so? And what the governing body can then inquire about is, do people understand how they can report unethical conduct? Are they comfortable to raise their concerns? Where can they go to? Do they feel that they're being heard? If there are complaints, are they being investigated and looked and followed up on? And the evidence then that the ethics office can provide would be kind of reports around the frequency of reporting, the frequency of discussions, the frequency of dialogue, what's the kind of fidelity of two-way communication, and also for senior managers to then report on these aspects at their management meetings. Then the other dimension that we pull up on the paper is about ethical treatment of people. And this is an important dimension because people need the way our employees experience our organization is through the way that they are treated. And what we want to do in this dimension is understand the degree to which employees are treated fairly, ethically, with dignity. And there's a strong correlation between this and the loyalty and the morale of our staff. And so what the Social and Ethics Committee wants to gauge through this dimension is, do employees feel that they're being treated fairly? Do they feel respected? Do they feel that they actually make an impact and that their voices are being heard? And the ways in which the Social and the Ethics Office can provide this feedback, as we set out in the paper, again, is through the findings from the Ethics Risk Assessment, from reports that the Ethics Office can combine around, are people adhering to rules, from surveys that will assess the morale, and basically from behavioral information that could come up from HR and labor relations as well. Now, it's important that we understand the connection between all of these different dimensions because they don't stand in isolation. And when we think about these dimensions, we need all of them in order to build a healthy ethical culture within our organizations. One of the most important aspects of these dimensions are around ethical awareness. And ethics awareness is really, we commonly say, about how do we make ethics real in our organizations. And a lot of our ethics offices focus their activities around ethics awareness. So that would be training, it would be awareness raising, it would be campaigns to get people to understand the code of conduct, values, what do we have in place, provide support mechanisms for ethics advice. And what the governing body can then ask through the engagements in the Social and Ethics Committee is be curious around what are the trainings, how many people are being trained, how are interventions being rolled out, and also how we're using the information and the insights that we get from our ethics risk assessment and then feeding that back into our ethics awareness campaigns so that we continuously having that loop around guiding our insights from what we understand to how we then make ethics real within our organization, and how are people understanding what is expected for them from an ethics perspective. So essentially what we try and do in the paper is we try to unpack these dimensions in a way that social and ethics committees can practically understand it and provide that guidance around what can be looked at from the oversight perspective, and then what can the ethics office do in terms of providing that information, and then one step further, potentially where can it find that information. We often say that ethics is everybody's business. A key role of the ethics office is to be able to manage the information and gain information from others who are contributing towards building the ethical culture. So we summarize the paper by saying that one of the key roles of the Social and Ethics Committee is that at the outset, the Social and Ethics Committee responsibility is about ensuring that when the ethics strategy is coming to the eye of the Social and Ethics Committee, that the interventions that are being proposed in that strategy are aligned to the ethical dimensions, and it's about consciously working towards building that ethical culture. And so upfront to exercise that oversight. And what we do in the paper then is, now when we're sitting in our social and ethics committees, what are we going to be looking at? What is the information that we want? And the role of the Social and Ethics Committee is then about evaluating the progress made towards improving these dimensions. What are the practical interventions? How are they being implemented? Is it being making an impact? And are these interventions actually happening so that we can have the impact? And then the last role of the Social and Ethics Committee, as we conclude on the paper, is then reporting on the progress of its oversight role to the governing body, but then also ensuring that this information is presented to broader stakeholders in the annual integrated report. John, I think I'm going to leave it at that point and then allow for comments and for the other speakers to come in as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Fatima, for that high-level overview. It is most helpful, and I know people are looking for this paper, and Julie indicated that she will make the full paper available to all participants. There you can also see it in the chat, so you will have access to the full paper after the end of this webinar today. But Fatima, thank you so much. There's already some questions for you coming in, and thank you to everyone. Some real interesting questions already in the Q&A, also some in the chat, but we encourage you to put your questions rather in the Q&A and not in the chat. But with that, we are now moving over to Dr. Claudel van Eck, or Claudel as we know her. Claudel, we are interested in your perspective. You had the opportunity to read the guidance paper beforehand. And just as an opening statement, what are your high-level impressions or comments on this guidance paper?
Thank you, Dion, and good morning to everyone. Let me firstly say that I commend the IoD for always staying on top of the areas where guidance is needed and true to form, always making sure that the finger's on the pulse in terms of where there may be areas where people are struggling. And I think generally speaking, in terms of looking at the paper, that the forum has really done a good job in terms of dealing with what is stated as the problem statement in the paper is the uncertainty around what an ethical culture is and how to affect an ethical culture through effective governance and oversight. So the approach that I took was to look at it from a high-level philosophical lens, through that lens, because I know that Getty is going to jump onto the practical on the ground perspectives of the Social and Ethics Committee. So from that high level, I asked myself the question, does the paper adequately respond to the problem statement? And I would firstly say that I think it's very important that the paper is not read in isolation. For example, it makes reference to the Ethical Culture Handbook. And I think it is important that when you read this paper, that you also make sure that you read the other guidance related to the topics that is being covered in the paper, to make sure that one has a well-rounded view, because this paper really is dealing with giving a almost, for lack of a better term, a structure in terms of approach. But for me, the devil is always in the detail, right? So my biggest concern that is, you know, a taxonomy, as important as it is, there's always the risk that we could quite easily fall into the trap of ticking the boxes without real application of mind. And that's really where I would like to focus in terms of at a high level considerations of the paper, is that we don't fall into that trap. That is, it's really important that leaders look at the full context and ensure that deep application of mind does happen within the structures of the organization, in particular at the level of the oversight body. And Fatima, I think you mentioned that the social and ethics committee's social component and the ethics component, those are two sides of the same coin. And I think it's really, really important that we don't isolate those two sides or see them as separate legs. So when we look to the side of the ethics, that we're absolutely able to still hook it into the social component, and very important, particular in the South African context, that we do take those social dynamics into consideration and the ethical implications in those. And then just a very important thought, I think, that we shouldn't lose sight of, is that the governing body has two legs that it stands on. The one is oversight and the other is the leadership component. And when looking at this paper, to have both of those two components in mind. So not just oversight, but also leading. So for me, the leadership component means that we as the governing body set the example. And I think where we need to also just overlay this paper, and this is why I said earlier on, make sure that you link it to the other guidance as well, is that we don't forget the governing body itself in the process. So we're looking at the employees and we're looking at the senior leadership in the organization. But really the oversight body, its the governing body, its committees and so forth, that combination itself has a culture. So that making sure that we have an understanding of what that culture looks like and how it impacts on the organization is also important. And then also making sure that we have a good idea of what the culture should look like. Just another thought is, for me, making sure that we also link the concepts and specifically ethics to the other governance principles, and not the paper does highlight the one that it hooks this paper on. But if you look at corporate citizenry, for example, and coming to that social component, when we hook it into there, then we can start to think a little deeper in terms of what it is that we should be looking at when we're talking about ethics. Otherwise, we only scratch at the surface and we don't really get to a deep level of where there's richness in the organization around the ethical considerations. And we then, as I said earlier on, just end up ticking the boxes. So just a few thoughts that I thought we need to just think about. The one is come in with the understanding that more often than not, study after study has shown this, that there's often a disconnect between what the top believes and what the bottom knows. So when you're engaging with the senior leadership, already come in with the professional skepticism in terms of understanding that that disconnect could be there, and be very careful in terms of how we build our assumptions and the lens that we look through. The other thing that I think that we need to also bear in mind, that cultures are layered. I mean, we talk about cultures from a little bit from a one-dimensional perspective. So what Fatima did was to look at the maturity levels of culture, and specifically in the context of an ethical culture. But remember, the bigger the organization is, the more complex it becomes. So you may have a dominant culture, and subcultures. And question is, how does that dominant culture prevail and do ensure that it doesn't suppress contrary views of what is right? And here in particular, the South African context, because we're not always on the same page in terms of what is right, and do we have the right conversations or the right level of conversation so that we can get to a common understanding that our views are impacted upon by our belief systems, our worldviews, our self-awareness, understanding of how others are impacted upon, a level of consciousness, in other words, right? So, because often we can look at ethics through a very personal, moral judgment perspective, as opposed to making sure that we all have a common understanding, and not just at the level where we're talking about fraud and corruption, but really a deeper understanding. Then I just want to caution that, when we talk about the assessments and the surveys, that they are really only as effective as their design. And here I think the committee needs to be mindful of bias that could be built into it, superficial results, be mindful of what behavior and how the results are used may be triggered. I have recently just had a conversation with a company where we could see that where people initially saw the survey as a tool where they could speak up, but they were punished in the process, and then they really started to pull back and stop speaking up. So be mindful of that, and be mindful that there's often a disconnect between what sits in the surveys and what comes out of conversations where people feel safe. And fear is not always about retaliation from the top. Sometimes it's about being ostracized in the middle. So the fact that you have that box that you can tick in terms of the surveys doesn't necessarily mean that you've pulled out meaningful results. Be mindful of the fact that when you do have the dialogues, it also doesn't mean that people are having meaningful dialogue, and that you can't just assume that having dialogues in place will result in a speak up culture. So we need to think about those kind of things where the culture in itself is not toxic, and that people are truly speaking their minds, and they're not holding back on those things that are really important. And then just also very importantly, I think that when we talk about holding each other accountable, we've got it in the taxonomy at the employee level, but I think we need to make sure that it runs through right up to board level, that board members set the example in terms of holding each other accountable. I cannot stress enough that we are in a South African context. So when you think about fairness, for example, make sure that we don't sit with a situation where you place all the responsibility of the fairness being coming through from the employees, that they would be the ones that will tell you whether they are being treated fairly, because employees are not always aware of whether they are being treated fairly or not. So there has to be deeper application of mind around ethical dilemmas and industry related and specific risks as well. Dion, I know that I've stepped over my time, so I'm going to stop there. And just maybe just say as a last word that also make sure that in the process that you don't lose sight in terms of a speak up culture, that you have whistleblower protection in place.
Very important points, Claudel, that you are raising. It was also echoed by Rada in the chat just now, saying excellent insights coming through. So thank you for further enriching our conversation. I will follow up with you afterwards. But let's first bring Getty into our conversation as well. And Getty, Claudel already indicated that you would take a much more granular look at this paper and the implications thereof. So over to you, Getty. Getty, you are still muted.
Yep. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And it's a privilege and an honor to be here with you this morning. And thanks that Claudette has actually probably, for me, set the scene in terms of talking at a more higher level of this topic, because the areas that she's pointed out, they are very critical and key for us to be able to say now at grassroots level or at practical level, what does this mean? Or what are we actually dealing with? I'm now just very cautious that I don't want to repeat what she has already mentioned. I might make comment on it when we speak later. But I'm also privileged to have had a couple of days spent looking through the guideline, which is a very valuable resource. The Ethics Institute and IoD are really on point in terms of just making sure that they keep us closer to the reality. Yes, we don't have to be just talking about talks and not making a difference in organizations, especially in areas that have to do with the behaviors, the attitudes, and what then are we saying in an organization about that? Especially, and more so, what are we saying when we're talking that in relation to business? Because there's a tendency to overemphasize, to say we'll talk about this after business, and my blood boils whenever I hear that, because you cannot underestimate the presence, the importance, and the effect that people have in an organization. But let me get off that bus a bit and come back to just my own take on the guidance paper, and just on my first impressions when I read it and looked at what we have been doing in areas where I'm exposed to, and what I have understood to be the purpose and the aim of what the role of the SEC, the Social and Ethics Committee, would be. My first impression was that this is a very practical and a paper from or suggestion from an implementation point of view. Why do I say that? The descriptive takes a very practical approach, which we have looked at, which you'll see on if you've now seen the paper, the table that has been suggested, the dimensions. And I'm just, I think I'm emphasizing what has been stated already, but it's important that we understand that those dimensions are building on the introduction of the building blocks as they appear in the ethical culture handbook, which I think Claudette has just mentioned, that you just need to have sight of that when you want to understand and fully appreciate what is then being suggested here in the guideline. The set of measurements I find that they are fairly flexible in their application. You can use them as means to evaluate what you already have in the organization, information that we have already asked, or can use it to improve the interventions that have been applied. And I would imagine that a combination of the two would also be feasible. So that flexibility I find important. And the question format, I related it to well, because it provides a flexibility and clarity on what is actually sought as evidence, and the detail to be used for evaluation. I also find that the approach in the inclusion of the area or part or where, how that the question or the required information will be found is user friendly. And I do note that, and it's also in my own personal experience, that we don't often have only just the ethics office, but would have other people or other structures that are being used to actually be the consolidator of the information. And that does become a challenge when you have an environment that is decentralized. So there would need to be a thought on a practical approach to make sure that there is that consistent theme, or there is consistency across the organization. I would also like to believe that the various reports, tools, surveys that have been mentioned or suggested as where evidence can be found, is information or data that the organization would have in its possession, or it's part of the output from the various functions, particularly the HR or the human capital area. And therefore, it limits us, or it somehow not eliminates the need to reinvent the wheel, as it were. And we often hear those who have to put out reports feeling like they are just recycling all the material. But if you have one source of information that you can actually use for different areas, it becomes much more, I think, more effective to avoid and avoid duplication of effort. Yeah, and my next comment is on the guidelines, is around what I call the consistency it creates for both the Social and Ethics Committee and management, and the Ethics Office, or those who are assigned the responsibility of ensuring that they have the responsibility of being the center of where ethics management information resides. The proposed questions or suggested questions, they give the SEC the guidance on the focus areas, particularly in the manner in which the questions are being positioned, and even where there are doubts, most of them they start to give a deeper dive or in specific issues that would need to be attended to or need to be addressed in order to talk to specifically the fairness, the effectiveness, the transparency, and therefore reestablishing this consistency I'm referring to. And as a result, I feel that the evidence which would then be provided would be very much specific. It will have to be specific to address the questions that are raised, and to reduce the second guessing we sometimes experience in SECs, where information just gets provided. You'll have to decide, or you determine for yourself as to which one actually is most appropriate or not appropriate. And that is a frustration that I believe would actually assist all the various structures, including the governing body, because there'll be consistency on, and I think Claudette's referred to it, that throughout the organization, then we know what is it that we want to make reference to, what is it that we are speaking to, or we expect rather to be answered, or questions to be, responses to be provided to. Coming to the non-managerial employees and the middle management, Fatima mentioned that those are the groups of people internally in the organization who tend to be in majority, and they would then have a significant input into the success or positive results in building an ethical culture. And in my mind, these are the people who are also at the coalface, and they provide the taste of the pudding, as it were, in terms of what this ethical culture is. And I think Claudette touched on the very critical areas, therefore, that you need to make sure that they are not closed over when you are actually dealing with those groups of people, specifically those at the bottom end of the chain, as it were. The questions and the line of inquiry, which is suggested in the guidance, I find clearly surfaces those issues which are sometimes regarded as too subjective. So we want to know, or are intangible, or are said to be time consuming. Time consuming for who? Because we want the culture that we can actually believe it's authentic. We can believe it's a culture that is being lived up to, not what we are expecting or what we believe it could be, which then leads us to perhaps just glossing over issues, or as it's been mentioned, ticking boxes on some areas. The suggested reports that and evidence to be provided for, in my mind, is a very reasonable anchor, and it gives both the Social and Ethics Committee and the reporting management a common set of information to analyze. And I do note that in most parts, there is a suggestion that the same surveys, instruments, and findings could be used, but the difference will be in the emphasis depending on the dimension that is being addressed at the time. I want to just briefly touch on this leadership commitment to ethics, Prof, if I may, just saying that we say that the tone is set at the top, and Fatima mentioned that that's why we have the leadership commitment being a requirement, and the senior management and the executive levels are expected to be walking the talk, as it were, and making things more visible and creating the visibility that would be required. But I have a question in my mind as to who actually is a person who would be making sure that those individuals, that senior executive, that leadership team has the competency and has the understanding of what they should actually be doing so that they can be effective in their role. I think I can partially answer myself to that, to say, Claudette started touching on, we shouldn't, I think in the paper, we should perhaps just make sure that there is reference to also the other stakeholders in this process, i.e. the very Social and Ethics Committee and the governing body. They need to be making sure that they become the players as well. You can be a referee, but you also need to be a player. You can't set rules for someone else which you are not adhering to yourself. May I please stop there for now? I will make other comments later. Thanks, Seb.
Thanks, Getty. Some very interesting points that you raised, and I will also come back to you. But let me start with Claudel. And there's an interesting question related also to what I would like to ask you, Claudel. You mentioned in your introductory remarks about us being sensitive to the social context and the social dynamics within which we talk about ethics. But then Janice in the Q&A also posed a question, and I want to read it. Well, it's not so much a question as a comment. She says, Dr. van Eck, a very interesting development in the governance of ethics at stakeholder level or grassroots level, she says. The consequence of enforcing companies' ethics is not accepted at community level when it means exclusion from business economic activity. Principles of fairness, competition, and equal opportunity are not valued outside of the organization, due, of course, to dire social circumstances and inequity. The consequence is personal risk to company employees. Security of those who live in and among the same community is a very real risk, which I think to some extent emphasizes the point that you make. But could you elaborate on that? What did you have in mind? And also specifically in response to the comment made by Janice there.
Yeah, thank you, Dion, and thank you, Janice. That's a really, really good question. So firstly, let me say that when we talk about a corporate citizen, we need to have a clear understanding within our organization of what exactly does that mean. So if you're a citizen within the context of a society, then you can't live in that society in isolation of the society. And so the next question then is, what is our responsibility in the South African context? And you touched on the fact that there's inequality, there's history in terms of why we are where we are. So how do we take people along? You know, so sometimes what we tend to do is take a little bit of a high and mighty approach, and we take our stance without thinking about how do we ensure that the community understands the long-term benefits to the community in terms of our approach. I think one of the things that worry me in South Africa is that we are so focused on those parts of our society that are so driving towards corruption and a society that is just me, that we forget that the bulk of South Africans are actually really wanting to see an ethical society. And if we start to partner more and more with those South Africans, and we create a network, not seeing ourselves just as a company, but as a corporate citizen with the other citizens, collectively we become stronger. But it is about adding that into our strategy and not just have a one-dimensional view in terms of how we implement our ethics strategy. And just in terms of the personal risk, Dion, that is a big issue. It's an issue that I think that organizations are not having enough conversations around. How do we ensure that we help our people to not just us looking after them, but also how they prepare themselves to minimize the risk around them as well. And often it is also in terms of how you approach things, how you convey messages. But that has to be part of the strategy, protecting your people and helping your people to protect themselves. It's got to be central to the strategy.
Thanks, Claudel. Getty, I would like to follow up on something that you specifically said, and I sort of sense a frustration coming out of practical experience. I know you sit on quite a number of boards and also social and ethics committees. And that's the frustration about sort of haphazard information on ethics flowing to the social and ethics committee, or inconsistent information or inadequate information. But instead of dwelling on that frustration, and I think as a chair of two social and ethics committees, I also sometimes experience that frustration that the right information is not flowing to the committee. Could you elaborate on maybe leading practice, also what you experienced in places where it works quite well and where you do get the right information, adequate information, timely information? What would your recommendations to other social and ethics committees and also to reporters to social and ethics committees be?
Thanks, Prof. I think that's a very difficult question, but I would give my sense of what I think I've seen sort of working or giving at least some sense of there's a way of a way forward here is what. Firstly, the committees that have topics that tend to be converging. For example, the audit, the Social and Ethics Committee, the Remuneration Committee, or the Human Resources Committee, there should be someone who and who sort of gives an oversight to see that we deep diving in the right areas. You know, we're not taking the same report and just saying, well, they're going to see what they want from here. And I think there was Fatima mentioned something around the management signing off on the reports, but that could be one area where we're seeing some, that could be a way forward, you know, and if it's practiced consistently, because I think what I see on the ground is there would be a decision taken that this one can just go because it's just reporting. You know, we're just making them aware, or we're just supplying them with information or telling them what we've done. And I think this is where perhaps we would this paper helps us to start having a little bit more focus on what is expected, and where do you find it, and what are you providing to the committee, is responding to the real issues. Give us the impact. We don't want to know that there were so many. Let me just pick on an example of training sessions. So many training sessions. That's not as important to me. I would argue that what was in the training and what did we get out of that training? What was the output? What people who attended that training said about the impact the training had on them? And in fact, what was the input? How did we drive? How did we get to have that? We didn't just take it off the shelf and say, we're going to tick off so many this year, and that is done. And at the same time, we have to be careful about our role. Our role is giving oversight and reporting. So we need to be making sure that those who provide that input give us what is actually required, so that even the deliberations can be even more focused, and we take it, we know that we're talking from the same song sheet, as it were.
Okay, thanks, Getty. Before I get to Fatima, because Fatima, there's a number of questions directed to you as well, but there's a standard question. I know from experience, when you do presentations on ethics and you don't start with the definition of ethics, someone will interrupt you and say, so what do you mean by ethics? And this morning is no exception. Timothy says, please, could I get a definition of ethics? It's easy to get the definition via Google. However, it's difficult to find a definition that applies to social and ethics committees. That is, what is the definition and how do we apply it in the context of the Social and Ethics Committee? Now, Timothy, let me try to get that out of the way very briefly. We always define ethics around the triangle of the self, the good, and the other, implying that one is ethical when you don't only consider what is good for yourself, but balance that with what is good for others, or as the golden rule states, always do good unto others as you expect others to do good unto yourself. So you can see it's always that triangle of the self, the good, and the other. But when we talk about the Social and Ethics Committee, then of course we don't talk about personal ethics, but we talk about organizational ethics. And in King 4, there is, in the glossary of King 4, you would see that there is a definition of organizational ethics. And it says something along the lines of, in the context of organizations, ethics refers to the ethical values. You can see that's a sense of the good that the organization, the self, applies in its conduct, its decisions, and its relationship with stakeholders and the broader society. So that's the other. So contextualizing this within the context of the Social and Ethics Committee, the oversight responsibility of the Social and Ethics Committee is to ensure that those values are embedded in the ethical culture of the organization. And we need to fulfill an oversight role, but also a strategic advisory role to organizations regarding their ethics strategies. Fatima, going to you, there are three questions that I would like to combine here because they deal with similar issues. Nyasa says, how can the information that the Social and Ethics Committee need be acquired if there is no formal ethics structure or ethics office in an organization? Janice has a related question. How can we get the right information in an organization where the ethics management function is decentralized? In other words, it's not focused in a specific office or a specific person. And then Buchle says, in companies without an ethics office, where is the next best place to deal with ethics? So you can see there's a common thread there. If there is not a distinct, easily identifiable home for ethics in the organization, how do you deal with that? And how do we get the right information to the Social and Ethics Committee?
Okay, thanks, Dion. And we do find this, we often say that ethics is a journey, and many organizations, as they are coming to embrace the understanding of ethics, in many places, ethics doesn't have a home as yet. and it's kind of crawling to find a home. But organizations are embracing the concept of the importance of ethics. So we do find that sometimes it can be split across organizations, and somewhere between audit, risk, compliance, and governance is this kind of responsibility and awareness around ethics. In our experience, what we see is that the custodians of driving ethics within the organization take on the responsibility of compiling the reports to ensure their submission into the Social and Ethics Committee. I want to take one step back, Dion, and just say that the role of the Social and Ethics Committee is also important, and especially the chair of the Social and Ethics Committee, in terms of being able to understand who are the different components that are going to be reporting to us, and what do we need and what would we like to see, so as to ensure that what we get in the time that we have is useful and we're able to exercise that oversight. And often we say, you know, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. So if you're able to almost manage as the Social and Ethics Committee, and specifically the role of the chair, what we expect, it is greater, there's a greater likelihood of the outputs to be better. So maybe just to throw that in. And then aside from that, I mean, and from the questions that are coming, when there aren't actually formal mechanisms that are sitting in place, we don't have to overcomplicate things. When we're starting and we really see ourselves as this baby that's starting to crawl, we need to be realistic about what are the management information systems that we have in place, and how can we collate what we have in a matter that is going to give non-executive directors who don't have insight onto the everyday operations of our organization a perspective around what we're doing and making it an impact and making a positive impact on ethical culture. And that's a very contextual contextual conversation. And it's important to be able to then look at those mechanisms, collate that information, and present it back to the Social and Ethics Committee in a manner that is palatable and understandable. Dion, I think I'll stop there. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, it always amazes me. I think when it comes to financial management or marketing management or any other dimension, we easily assume that we need people to manage those things. They won't manage themselves. It always surprises me that when it comes to ethics, we think that ethics can manage itself. And I'm also sometimes a bit skeptical about the integrative approach that we say there's no one responsible for ethics, everyone is responsible for ethics. And I'm on record for saying that sometimes integration might amount to evaporation. So I think it is important that we do make someone responsible for the management of ethics in a similar manner that we do make people responsible for financial management, for example. Of course, everyone in the organization has a responsibility to contribute to the financial performance of the organization, as everyone in the organization has a responsibility to contribute to the ethics performance of the organization. But just that just as a side remark. Getty and Claudel, I want both of you to respond to this question, and it's actually also directed to both of you. And there's a lot of other questions in the Q&A dealing with leadership from the top, the tone from the top, and other related questions. But let's take Nelisbe's question, who I think summarizes it well. It says, based on what Getty and Claudel have touched on with regard to consistent tone from the top, coupled with employee commitment, should there then not be a compulsory 360 evaluation or assessment by lower level employees of the tone coming from the top? I would love to hear both of your responses to that. And Getty, maybe we can start with you this time.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the question. I think it's actually just starting to touch at the core of what we're dealing with when we're talking the ethical culture. And I think in the guideline, it also there is a suggestion that we could use the information coming out of the 360 degree evaluation to gather information that actually comes out there. Here is my, I think, a caution or a word of, yes, a word of caution around it is, we should ensure that the right information is or questions are actually being asked in that 360 degree. That's the first part. And secondly, the collation of the information thereof must not be filtered. You know, I've often gone to an extent in organization, and I know you start being told that you are now being operational, asking what was the question being asked when we got this output, when we got this finding. You find the question is actually a little bit superficial. It's just asking how you feel about manager X or what did, and the person gave a response that was very much detailed. And in that detail, we're just missing out to take out the relevant parts. And secondly, and this is what I've learned from the interaction with Claudel as well, is that sometimes you want to have more than one interaction or alteration, processing of this information. You should not just allow yourself to say, well, we did a 360, here are the results. Couldn't we just go another level? And I think Claudel also mentioned it this morning. Could we go to another level and just have this information distilled a bit more further so that we can actually surface what the real is, get to the bottom of the barrel, as it were. But because we're saying, no, we just need to cover this area and make sure that the assessment has been done, we end up with superficial results. And I still have to see an organization where we really say the 360 evaluation is going to have a direct correlation to what you are going to end up with as your final assessment as an individual. And it may just be impacting, it may be put in such a way that it actually dilutes your financial and your other, your core. What we call core is diluted by what comes out of this aspect in terms of your assessment. Yeah. One place I was involved in it's in the banking sector. We tried it, but because it was affecting people who were seen as those who bring the most in the organization, we ended up having to footsie around it, I must say.
Yeah, and Getty, you probably weren't able to see what's going on in the chat as you were speaking, but there's a lot of support for the point that you've just made. Claudel, your take on this, please.
Let me firstly say that I fully agree with Getty. I would then just add maybe a thought or two in terms of what I've seen in my experience. The one would be that if you do go that route and you don't do anything with the information, the employees will very quickly then start to become despondent and then see it as the top leadership really just going through the motions. That's the one. The other is if there's backlash. And I have seen situations where employees who thought they were completing anonymous surveys being called in and lambasted for giving negative responses in a survey. And so one has to be mindful of what can happen in the middle. And then just, I think, what is also important in the process, I mean, Getty, you touched on it in terms of going a bit deeper. What I've found is that when you start to go to a level where the organization is brave enough to have one-on-one conversations, and those one-on-one conversations generally better if an outsider does it, and an outsider that is skilled in the area of building trust and pulling out the right information and then giving a consolidated report through to the Social and Ethics Committee then you're starting to get to the real issues. I've been in situations where I've done interviews and you look at what's come out of the survey results and what comes out of the conversations, and often it's chalk and cheese. And you ask the question why, and it is because people are afraid. And they don't give real what they really think. But if you can get them in a situation where there is trust and they open up, then you get to the real information. But just be mindful also, I mean, just get his touch on this and how those questions are formulated. And I think that the S&E, so the Social and Ethics Committee can play a significant role in coming in with a fresh eye and asking the right questions about the questions. And that basically means that you need to have a good level of insight in terms of the social issues, the psychological issues, and so forth, for you to make a meaningful contribution.
Yeah, and Claudel, I can't agree more with you that we need to do this in a very solid manner. In other words, in a solid social scientific manner. Being at the Ethics Institute, we do a lot of risk assessments and culture assessments, and we find that the moment that you give executive leadership a picture that they don't like, they question your methodology, your sampling,
Yes.
whether you're at the right items. And therefore, it is extremely important that we don't do this in a sloppy manner, but that we do this in with the rigid disciplines that goes with proper social scientific research. Otherwise, we don't do ourselves any favors, and we don't have reliable results to work with, and also to make comparisons with yourself over time, but also with other organizations using similar instruments. Fatima, I would like to raise two of the questions with you that are very specifically related to ethics management in organizations. Let me just get to them here. Just a moment. Yeah. Leah asked, how can ethics be trained in organizations to ensure that everyone understands what ethical conduct is, especially since our country is going through a significant breakdown in ethical behavior? And Wendy latches onto this and raises the issue of whether ethics already needs to be a part of the recruitment process. In other words, even before people enter the organization, that it starts right at the beginning, but then Leah focusing much more on when people are in the organization, how should we think about training?
Okay, thank you. And Prof, there's huge appreciation for your tagline, which I think everyone's going to be using around integration and evaporation. So what we, in the paper, I think our approach generally as the IoDSA forum is we don't repeat resources that are sitting elsewhere, but we do cross-reference them. And so in our paper, we're really succinctly focusing on that oversight role, but there's a huge body of knowledge that sits underneath that. And one of them that I will use to respond to the question, Prof, is around the ethics management framework or the governance of ethics framework. What it does is it provides us a way in which we then navigate how to arrive at this outcome of an ethical culture. And in the heart of that ethics management framework, the center of it is about managing ethics. And what it does is it says, well, if you're going to manage ethics, you can't just start nowhere. You have to follow a process. And that would be firstly understanding the ethics risk assessment, which you've explained, and then using that insights from the ethics risk assessment in a way to inform everything else that you do. So by the time you're managing ethics or making ethics real, you've done it on a perspective that is informed. You've understood your reality and what are the things that are undermining ethics within your organization. You then go to your ethics strategy with that understanding and you say, okay, where would I like to go to? How am I going to get there? You check your codes and policies, you make sure your house is in order, and then you go off and you make ethics real. So by the time you're developing your ethics training programs, it's in a manner that's informed by this understanding that you've gained and this vision of where you want to be and how you want to get there. And it's important also in the work that we do, that we work quite extensively with social and ethics committee members. As Claudette, I want to take up on your point, to understand what is their mandate, what is, when we talk about ethics management, what does that look like? What does oversight look like? So that it's when we exercise oversight, we also provide guidance in a reassuring manner. So to the two questions, absolutely proactive. We say making ethics real has two elements. It's the proactive element, what we do to anticipate, and the reactive element, what we do when something happens. And a big part of the proactive element is when we anticipate what's going to happen before people enter our organization, and we focus on the recruitment. If our apples get into our barrel, what are we doing to manage those apples? So are we discerning? Are we checking? Are we doing pre-employment screening and vetting? By the time people come in, do we check them from our adverts? Are we doing enough, and where can we do better? Once they're in our organization, how do we keep it real? How do we keep ethics alive? And that insights again from the ethics strategy is so important as a golden thread. By the time you get to your ethics training, it's again done in an informed manner, because the ethics risk assessment gives you insight. What are our weak points? What are our vulnerable units? What are the areas that we need to focus on? So your training is not done willy-nilly. It's done in a very targeted and focused manner to achieve that broader outcome of an ethical culture. So yeah, Prof, I think, there's a lot of elements that we can do there, but those would broadly be the frame of reference within which one would approach dealing with both of these aspects.
Okay, thanks, Fatima. That is very practical advice about, as you say, making ethics real. There's a question, actually, the very first question that came in this morning that fascinated me. And Claudel, I'm going to ask you to start with this, but also get your take. And it says, Chris is posing the question, how accessible should the ethics committee be for ethical concerns from shareholders? It is. Should the company secretary be able to block concerns? Should their direct contact details be available to shareholders? Very interesting question. I look forward to your responses there.
It is a very interesting question, and thank you for putting me first on the line, Dion. Look, firstly, I think that instead of it being reactive in this kind of scenario, the organization needs to be proactive. And I would want to say that go beyond just shareholders and take a broader stakeholder perspective in how does the organization ensure that it receives information from its stakeholders in terms of its perceptions of the organizations, to what degree the organization is towing that ethical line. And do bear in mind, once again, for me, it is about what lens you're looking through and how we are communicating then what it is that we would try to get into the organization. Right, and then how does that filter through to the Social and Ethics Committee is a conversation that the committee needs to have to make sure that we don't have a situation where information can be blocked. This is not dissimilar for me. If you were to compare it to how do we ensure that information comes up with in terms of from the staff to the Social and Ethics Committee. It's about those feedback loops and applying our minds to where could there potentially be blockages. Are we perceived, and not just are, because we need to be, but are we perceived to be open in terms of the feedback loops and the transparency in the process? Interesting that in terms of the company secretary brings me to the point of making sure that everybody in the ecosystem, that ethics governance ecosystem are on the same page, because you're going to get blocking if we're not on the same page. Otherwise, the information should be coming through. Can I just make this last point, Dion, in terms of the feedback coming through from your broader stakeholdership is that when we look at the definition and how we define ethics, that we also have enough self-awareness to understand that what we may think is good for, what I and Claudel may think is good for Getty may not agree with that. And so it's about being responsive, but also being open enough to listen. And if you're all on the same page from that perspective, I think your risk of the information being blocked is then much, much lower.
Thanks. I think very valid response there, Getty. But let's hear your side, please.
I think if a mine is just to add to what Claudel has said, I'm worried if there's even a sense of somebody gets to be blocked. You know, so it means there's something that's broken somewhere. That's my first response. It means, let me adopt the term that Claudel is using, the ecosystem. There's something that we're not getting right. And if we're going to have our company secretary now playing the role of being a gatekeeper, that's not the appropriate role that they should be playing. You know, we're not on the same song sheet, therefore, because the other points, that the other dimensions that we refer to in the guideline, like the treatment of people, what does that mean? Because already it means there are question marks around that, and the ethics talk. What are we allowing people to talk about or not to talk about? And I think it's beginning to perhaps pose a question, Fatima, for us to say, in the guideline, what should we be saying about the stakeholder, the rest of the stakeholders, because they are also the recipient, or somehow they are part of this continuum. So we may need to just make sure that we leave, or we either provide a way in which that information that insight can actually be brought in, because as Claudel said, we're not doing the we're not implementing nor having an effective ethical culture for ourselves. It must be for the broader organization. And the very first issue that I think Claudel alluded to, the social side of the ethics. We must be able to just make sure that we don't close it off completely, because in some organizations, I have experienced that some of the stakeholders, especially the external stakeholders, they are most critical to the culture that we are we're trying to build up to. And if they don't understand it, then there's a problem. And if we don't align to what their expectation or their perceptions are, we may miss the point. We think we're right. You know, it can't be. It must be right for the whole organization, including the other stakeholders that we have in your shareholders, the communities in which the business or the organization is part of or is based. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to add to what both of you have said, of course, King 4 is quite clear that shareholders don't have a position of priority over other stakeholders. In other words, the interest of shareholders is on par with those of other stakeholders, which of course does not mean that we can exclude them. And I think both of you made the point very eloquently. And also in terms of the King 4 recommendation, for social and ethics committees under Principle 8, it adds that stakeholder engagement should be part of the mandate of the committee. If we go back to the statutory mandate, it only talks about monitoring employee relations and monitoring consumer relations, but it does not mention other stakeholder relations. And I think King 4 nicely opens it up to say we always need to be constantly aware of stakeholder concerns across the spectrum of all our stakeholders. And I totally agree, it should never be blocked. I now have a question, probably it might be the last question before we go to some closing remarks. For those of you who are not in South Africa, we are currently going through some serious load shedding. Our national electricity provider puts us on a schedule where they switch off our power from time to time for 2 hours, sometimes even 4 hours at a time. And therefore, it does not surprise me that Prof. Nick Williefield said in the chat, this webinar should be compulsory for all employees and leaders of state-owned enterprises. And his sentiment received some very positive support. But there's a question also related to Eskom, our energy provider. And I want to ask this question to all of you. Fatima, I'm going to put you on the spot this time. What is the role of the Social and Ethics Committee? Yeah, I suppose, let me rephrase it. What role could the Social and Ethics Committee play to help to address the issues of poor performance at Eskom? In other words, it now brings the work of the Social and Ethics Committee directly in relation to one of the 4 key outcomes of good governance. We know the first outcome is the ethical culture, and we discussed that. But the second outcome is good performance. And I'm quite sure that there is a link. I'm more than sure, I know there is a link between the ethics of the organization and the performance of the organization. But Fatima, let's start with you.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about the Social and Ethics Committee, it plays, as you've explained, a very critical role, both on the perspective around how are we managing ethics within our institution to provide that feedback back to the governing body, and then how are we being perceived as a corporate citizen? How are we being experienced in terms of the fulfillment of our mandate across those? And the Social and Ethics Committee has a critical role to elevate that up to the governing body, and through the organization, to provide that perspective in terms of reputational risk, in terms of trust, in terms of legitimacy, and in terms of the environment around ethics and ethical culture. And certainly the Social and Ethics Committee would bear that responsibility in the context of Eskom to be able to provide that feedback and raise that alarms, and also in a way that would provide advice and guidance in terms of then what can be done about that. Yeah, so I think that would be where I would come in with that. I'm happy to hear from others.
But I see Getty is quiet, so, so I'll go next. And I agree with Fatima, but I'll probably just add that, and look back to what I said right at the beginning in terms of our broader lens in application of mind. So if one looks at the issues of Eskom in terms of performance, I think a lot of it is rooted in the recruitment process in terms of making sure that we've got people who are adequately skilled. And then your next step in terms of making sure that there's ongoing training. The other issue would be, are we focusing on the right things? Now, those are all perceived as performance-related issues, but in all of those things, for me, there are ethical implications. If you are very deliberately going to employ people who are not necessarily adequately skilled, there's an ethical implication in that. And what is the impact going to be on the organization, and what would be the impact on society? On this other side of the coin is that individual, in terms of accepting a job that you may not be adequately skilled for, the ethical implications in that action. So, and the Social and Ethics Committee being able to lift out the ethical risks in our recruitment processes, in our whether we're training or not, and so forth. How do we ensure that from a performance perspective, we look at all the various performance dimensions, look at the ethical risks in there and how the organization is addressing it, and not see itself separate from the performance and in the organization. So for me, this is a great example of deep application of mind in ethical implications in just about everything.
mm, mm, mm.
Thanks, Gladel. Getty?
Thanks, Prof. And I have very little to add to what the colleagues have said here. I think we would be talking in two mouths if we say we must be ethical this end and we must then performance we ignore. To me, it's just not. It's not even a starting point. Because you commit to what you need to be doing. You commit, and once you've committed to that, you must be transparent. You must be consistent. If there are other issues that are at play, let them be surfaced. Let them be dealt with in the structures right up to the governing body, or if you like, the shareholder in this instance. Those are things that need to be that needs to be a reality that is faced. However, I'm very mindful of the fact that here we're actually starting to talk about an area where we know where the problem lies, and we just we are using what we would find applicable in what you'd call a business as usual, in a business unusual situation. So it is a concern that we do have people who can actually be made and given responsibility to turn this around, to make sure that performance happens, but we just we just focus on other issues. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, thanks. Gladel and Getty, before I will ask each of you to give us a final word of wisdom in terms of a takeaway point for social and ethics committees to improve the ethical culture, I want to ask a last question to Fatima here, and I think it's a sentiment that is often raised. And Tefu says, there's a saying that ethics is an individual choice and that the approach endeavors of the organization will have little impact on this choice. How would you comment to that? In other words, people are either ethical or unethical, we often hear, and there's not much that we can do about that. So I think the question basically is, can we influence the ethical behaviors of people in the organization, or is it the fact that they are either ethical or unethical? There's not much that we can do about that.
Thanks, Prof. In our work, we reflect on the ethics management process, and we say 10% of people in organizations are what we consider to be good apples, and 10% of people are what we consider to be bad apples. That means they look for ways to outsmart the system and probably very unlikely to change those people. But the bulk of our organization, the 80% sit on the fence. They are what we call decent, everyday citizens, want to do that, I think, but dubious in the sense that they could fall either way. And when we think about managing ethics in our organization and leaving it to chance, we're focusing largely on that 80%. That decent but dubious. And what we try to do when we talk the language of proactive ethics management and training and awareness raising is we're shaping our barrel and we proactively bringing this 80% closer to the good apple so that we have the sort of culture that we want to have. And we need the bad people to be managed through consequence management and the processes that need. But definitely there is scope for being able to influence and proactively manage ethics within our institutions, and hence the endeavors that come out in terms of understanding and doing something about it and not just leaving it to chance. So, Prof, that would be the basis on which we would approach shaping the ethical culture and dealing with informing people's sense of ethical awareness within organizations.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that our ethical values are always formed in communities. We don't sit in our bedrooms and develop our ethical values. Our ethical values are very much shaped by the families in which we grow up, the schools in which that we attend, but also the organizations that we work in. And in a similar manner, once again, as we can motivate people to be financially prudent, for example, we can also motivate people to be ethical. And we can influence ethical conduct and also ultimately ethical values. Important, however, is what motivation strategies will be used. And we know the most popular two are either punishment or reward. In other words, a form of extrinsic motivation. If you do the right thing, you will receive certain benefits. If you do the wrong thing, expect certain penalties. But the problem with that is that people will only do the right thing as long as somebody is watching. So therefore, it is important that over time, we do start motivating people in a different way so that they become intrinsically motivated. In other words, the motivation to do the right thing comes from the inside. But that's a process that takes persuasion. It does not happen overnight. But leadership example, talking about ethics, setting an example to the organizations, all of these things are powerful mechanisms to influence the conduct of people. And I think we should steer clear from the notion that we can do nothing about ethics, because value formation, including our ethical value formation, is a lifelong process that only stops the day that we die. Okay, final words of wisdom, as I've asked, and this time I'm going to start with Getty, and then Claudel will give the last word to you.
Thanks, Prof, and thanks, colleagues, and thanks everyone who's been part of this. We really appreciate this session. I have been enlightened here myself, and also just listening to or reading what the comments people make. It gives me the impression and a sense that there's hope. We are beginning to take this area as very important. A part of what we're doing in the organizations, and those who are involved with specific areas and accountable for certain deliverables, they are actually here to just share the knowledge, understand what they were, or seek some more information and get clarity. That I have really appreciated more than anything else. But my parting shot, if I may, Prof, is that there was part which I felt I'd spoken too much and then I hadn't actually got into, is that and I think Fatima and Claudette did touch on it, the fact that if you really want to have a good understanding and a good basis of how to apply this guideline, you need to ensure that you have an understanding, or you have reread, and for me personally, I had to read it 3 times, and it's still sitting here on my screen. The Ethical Handbook, version 3. And I'll tell you why I'm saying the version 3, because I had a copy which is a hard copy, and I realized that version 3 actually has 2 areas which I found to be very appropriate and very relevant, and that is the practical take on an ethical organizational culture, as well as the insight into the ethical culture in a virtual organization. I found those 2 to be very topical, relevant areas, because they are bringing us to the area of life or working life where we are at right now, and that is the times we're living in, where there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of unknowns, and we have to guide ourselves and others in the uncharted territory, and that I found to be quite useful and very practical. Thanks for that, and big ups to thanks to the Ethics Institute and the IoD for actually making that accessible.
Thanks, Getty. Claudel?
Thank you, Dion. And just maybe as a parting shot from my side, I think I would like to emphasize that the Social and Ethics Committee must always remember context, make sure that the members of the committee collectively have a good handle on the internal and the external context of the organization, because that informs a hell of a lot in terms of what it is that we need to emphasize and where we need to focus. But when I say context, it's really about that deep understanding and being brave enough at this committee level to have the uncomfortable conversations, because there are some uncomfortable conversations for us as South Africans to have that have significant implications on how we see ethics within our organization. And I think, Dion, it's you that mentioned, that ethics won't manage itself. Understanding human nature is that most of us have been conditioned to think of ourselves as good people, and therefore you sometimes have this resistance to ethics training and so forth. The penny only dropped for me why focus on ethics is important when I did my DPhil back many moons ago. It feels like a long time ago now. To start to understand that it is not just about me being a good person. It's not just about my personal values, but the ability to see ethical implications in so many things around us and to navigate through ethical dilemmas. And when we understand that, then we can start to drive the right conversations and the right behavior. And maybe just as a last point, where I think the committee can also help to oil the organization and moving in the right direction is, what are the reports that are going through to the board? For example, when the executive team is proposing a new project, whatever proposal it may be, is there a section in the report that talks about ethical implications, that shows that the executive team has applied its mind to the ethical implications, shows that to the board, and then the board can also engage with that. Yeah, those would be my last thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, and maybe just a parting shot from my side as well. If I have one takeaway, I think the Social and Ethics Committee can play a very significant role in governing ethics in organizations on behalf of the governing body. But they can only do so if they get the right diet. In other words, if the right information reaches them. And I think very often as members of social and ethics committees, as we all are, we might be tempted to blame management for saying, you don't give us sufficient information. But I think there's a huge responsibility on the Social and Ethics Committee to be proactive and also to indicate to management what are the things that you should report on us or to us in order to fulfill our governance of ethics mandate. So we should not sit back and just critically look at what is reported. We need to play a very proactive role in determining what should be reported, not only the content, but also the format. And I think this specific paper empowers us to do exactly that. So with that, I would like to, first of all, thank our two panelists this morning, Claudel and Getty. Nice as always to have you as part of a conversation. And if you look at the chat, you would see that there's huge appreciation for the insights that you shared, as well as Fatima. Thank you for playing the lead role in compiling this paper. We know the principal author was Dr. Paul Foster, but for coordinating that process. And then also to our audience, thank you for all the many comments in the chat, which was very interesting. Thank you for all the questions in the Q&A and for your attendance, and also for the very supportive comments that you made. And finally, Julie, to you and the team at the IoDSA for hosting this. Thank you. I think this was the most valuable event. Over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Deanna, much appreciated. I do think this was one of those real energy-giving sessions where you come away feeling inspired and thoughtful on the content. I would really like to hear back from our audience members. I can see you all dropping off quickly to go about your day, but there's a QR code. I'd really like you to scan that QR code for me, please, and give us your feedback. And all the stuff that was mentioned today, all the papers, the links to everything, we will post in a post-event communication. And I saw there was a few questions about the version 3 of the Social and Ethics Committee handbook. I don't know if there is such a thing, Dion, but if there is, no, not yet. We're still on version 2, so don't worry. Getty was just referencing for the next one, but so there is no version 3, and version 1 and 2 version 2 is on the website, but I will also all send these links to you. It's all available there. And thank you very much. I really appreciate the participation from our audience members and our panelists. Thank you and have a fantastic day further.